about now? Okay. That should be working. Probably need to move my mouth closer to it. It's not working at all. Not a thing. It looks like it works when it's upside down. All right. Seems to be. Oh, there we go. Look at that. Just took me tickling it. So I begin with the opening of the Word and prayer. All nations shall come unto thee. Let us pray. Our Father, who art in the heavens, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, as in heaven, so upon the earth. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. O Lord, forgive us our trespasses,
as we forgive those who trespass against us.
Amen. The reading I'm going to do is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 66, beginning with verse 15 of that chapter. For behold, the Lord will come with fire, and with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury, and his rebuke with flames of fire. For by fire and by his sword will the Lord plead with all flesh, and the slain of the Lord shall be many. They that sanctify themselves and purify themselves in the gardens behind one tree in the midst, eating swine's flesh, and the abomination and the mouse, shall be consumed together, saith the Lord. For I know their works and their thoughts, and it shall come that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. And I will set a sign among them, and I will send those that escape of them into the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, and Lud, that draw the bow to Tubal and Javan, to the isles afar off, that have not heard my fame, neither have seen my glory. And they shall declare my glory among the Gentiles. And they shall bring all your brethren for an offering unto the Lord out of all nations, upon horses and on chariots, and in litters, and upon mules, and upon swift beasts, to my holy mountain Jerusalem, saith the Lord, as the children of Israel bring an offering to a clean vessel into the house of the Lord. And I will also take of them for priests and for Levites, saith the Lord. And as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. Amen. And please rise for the benediction and closing of the word, if you will. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Amen. Be seated. So I'm going to start off with a test, see how well you've paid attention through the last several decades, and see if anybody knows, aside from ministers who have been taught all these things and have not let anything escape their memory from theological school, how many chapters are in the book Heaven and Hell? 12. Not the right answer. It's okay if you don't know. It's not something probably you ever got taught, but I do want to show you. There are 63. There's the contents. You can see the small print. So 10, 20, 25 on that page. And then here's the rest of heaven, and that is 43 chapters, or, sections. And then the world of spirits goes from 44 to 55, so about 11, almost 12. And then hell, 56 to 63. So there's a lot of subjects in the book Heaven and Hell. And I'm going to talk about one chapter out of Heaven and Hell, particularly tonight, and that is the section on the heathen. The word heathen means nation. And so when it says, I'll gather all nations to me, that's the same word as I'll gather all heathen to me. And the heathen are distinguished from many other peoples in that in the writings, it talks about the heathen, but then it talks all about the Muslims as a religious group, talks about others that aren't Christian, and then sort of categorized as a group of people who are not Christian are the heathen, other than the Mohammedans. And if you think carefully about it, as the teachings of the new church were given, the new church was given to become the new center of spirituality on earth, the new religion. And so outside of the Christian religion, in one sense, aren't all nations then heathen, or all other religions heathen religions? Is that what heathen means? I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what the Lord's telling us in Heaven and Hell about the heathens, or the Gentiles, or the nations. Now, here's another test. Even if you're in theological school, you can see if you can answer it, or went through theological school. Did you go through theological school, Naomi? Did you go to theological school? Didn't you take some Mars courses? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you did. Okay. Not the Mars ones. Okay. Well, they have, there's more than just the ministers that get to go to theological school. There's a whole other track or other section for those who are doing an advanced study in religious studies. What's it called? Mars, right? What's that stand for? Masters of Arts in Religious Studies. So whether you did that or just been looking at the writings and studying them yourself individually, do you know where heaven and hell is primarily drawn from? Are all the subjects in heaven and hell brand new and fresh subjects, or are they drawn from earlier works of the writings? A lot.
Yeah, it came not quite on the heels of the Arcana, but
Right.
pretty close. It was fairly early on.
Yes, it was pretty soon after the Arcana was published that Heaven and Hell, some other works were also published. I think Heaven and Hell was one of the first major individual books after the Arcana. And it's not that crucial to have that information. I won't give a real test with grades on it because I'm not sure I would pass it. So in book 3 of the English edition of the Arcana Celestia, there's an interchapter section on concerning the state and lot in the other life of the nations and people born outside the church. So a lot of what is written in the chapter in Heaven and Hell is taken from this interchapter material that is published right after the end of chapter 20. Anybody ever figured out why the Lord had Swedenborg write the interchapter material he did when he did it? Have you got a theory about that? Any ideas? Is it just random that, let's see, it sometimes feels random, but are there any accidents when it comes to the Lord giving the second coming? Isn't there some sort of divine leadership? And it's the word of the Lord. It's taking place not randomly or according to the whims of the revelator. It isn't according to the best guess of Swedenborg. Well, let's see. What should I throw in there now? And you may believe what you may believe. There's no doctrine of the church that tells us we must believe that every interchapter material in the Arcana is based on some formula that has been derived from doctrinal understanding. As far as I know, there's no clear set of teachings that tell us why infants in heaven are talked about here, or the nature of the Word is talked about there. You can guess after chapter 21 where Sarah and Abraham conceive Isaac, and Isaac is born, and the first divine rational is being developed in Isaac, that right after that comes the first systematic treatment of conjugal love. Wow, okay. Conjugal love, the divine unit of divine love and wisdom together in the divine marriage, descends into what's called the heavenly marriage, which is the union of good and truth among people or in creation, from which descends the marriage of the Lord and the church, the marriage of the conjugal between husband and wife, right down to worms and butterflies that are representatives of the things of conjugal love in nature. And the Lord explains that when the divine love and wisdom of the Lord's divine human was in the glorified divine human, which Isaac represents. Ishmael is the beginning of that. It develops into Isaac. Then afterwards, there's a systematic treatment of conjugal love. Isaac is maybe the reason why, or that state in the Lord's glorification. Prior to Isaac is the story of Ishmael. And it's after that treatment in Arcana Celestia chapter 20 that we're given the chapter on the lot of the heathen or the Gentiles. Are these bits of information just to give us something to understand concerning other people? Or is it something that we ought to be understanding within ourselves? Roger's shaking his head. What do you think, Roger?
To understand what it means, or it wouldn't have been put there.
That's what I think too. I've got to adjust this so I can actually look down at my text, and I might lose some. I lost more than some. Yeah, that seems to be working again. So let me walk you through. Yes, Gwenda? Oh, you thought you had your hand up. Okay.
Michael,
Yes.
I never quite thought of it that way, but, Swedenborg, when he's really fully open and he's really into the Arcana and all that, he's receiving concurrently all kinds of doctrinal material. And this will remind him of that, and he's tying it in too, and that's why he puts cross-references in his material as he goes through from earlier work, things that he's done. But coming up with, as you say, introducing, okay, he gets to a certain point and then starts writing conjugal love. That's because he's been brought to some point, and maybe in his spiritual mind, as it were at that time, it becomes, this is a good idea to introduce this whole subject, just throw it in there. I don't think it was, I don't see the writings as being a straight line situation.
It's a fascinating study, and people in the church are at various spectrums in terms of Swedenborg's awesome and wonderful, and the Lord used him, and he wrote all these wonderful things, and isn't he great, to people on the far end away from that saying, this was the Lord, and every detail of what was published and what wasn't published was due to the fact that this is divine revelation of the second coming. So take Swedenborg completely out of the picture. He's no more than the pen, a great pen, but he's simply the messenger. He's not the message. And don't confuse the messenger with the message. So Swedenborg had an as of self. Swedenborg talks about everything that he wrote from the Lord. Everything came from the Lord. Nothing came from himself. And I personally interpret that to mean even the organization, obviously the organization of his thoughts as he wrote them down into particular sentences, the chapters, the inner chapter material. Everything came from the Lord. Nothing came from himself. That's what he says as his own testimony over and over again about the nature of that. And again, it's not a crucial thing. It's just trying to picture, why now are we hearing about the state of the heathen? Why isn't that saved for the fourth volume of the Arcana? It's in the second volume of the Latin published works, the third volume of the English. be that as it may, something to reflect upon. So what are we told about the heathen or the nations? One of the first ideas that were delivered to us is the Lord wants everyone saved, and if you have the idea that some people get condemned because they're not Christian, remove that idea. So let me read the first section of this. 3:18 says, it's a general opinion that those born outside of the church, who are called the nations or Gentiles or heathen, cannot be saved because not having the word, they know nothing about the Lord. And apart from the Lord, there is no salvation. That's quite an argument, right? If you have a cut and the cut can't be closed, you're going to die. If your salvation depends on knowing the Lord and you don't know the Lord, you're going to not go to heaven. I mean, it's sort of a cut and dry type of thing. Without this, you don't get that. You don't heal a wound, you're going to die. You don't get salvation from Jesus Christ by confessing Him and knowing the teachings of His Word, you go to hell. That's sort of an idea that is out there. And it's bolstered by what we know in the second coming, misunderstandings of the literal sense of the word. And I talked about this in church on Sunday, the 144,000 that are saved. Well, too bad if you're not one of those, you're going to hell. So the Lord makes it clear right from the beginning, when we're talking about those people, the other group of people that aren't us Christians, when we're talking about those people, you should know right away that they're not condemned for not having the Word. It straight out says in 2 lines later, these people are born human beings, and their ignorance of the Lord is not their fault. I mean, it makes sense, right? It makes sense. It's not their fault. You can't blame a baby for not having what they don't have. You can't blame a child growing up far away from the church for not having what hasn't been given to it. And therefore it says, salvation is provided by some means to everyone. Therefore, the Lord has provided a religion for everyone, and by it acknowledgement of the divine and interior life. For to live in accordance with one's religion is to live interiorly, since one then looks to the divine, and so far as they look to the divine, they do not look to the world, but what separates themselves from the world, that is, the life above the world, and they see the life in the world as an exterior life. Everybody basically can see that there's something better than themselves, unless they're taught out-and-out falsities, and some of the Gentiles do have teachings of out-and-out falsity. But they're not condemned just because they're not Christians. And that's just, we hear about it so often, we probably take it pretty much for granted. But, there are a lot of people that carry around the idea that if you don't know Jesus Christ, you're going to hell. There's just no way around it. That's what it says right here, 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 and here. So we have the advantage, obviously, of the teachings of the new church, the second coming, and an understanding, obviously, of the interior sense of the word, and that we don't take those statements of the word literally. But there's also something within us, innate in all of us, that wants to think that we're better than those people, right? That there's others out there that aren't as good as us. It's an innate tendency of the human proprium to love what is of its own. That means me and my wife and my children and my brothers and sisters and my parents and my family and somewhat of my extended family and, my community and my tribe. We're the ones. We're special. And lots of people get taught that when they're growing up. They're taught to have pride in their family and family above everything else. They get taught that about their country, perhaps, that, if you don't love your country, then leave it. Get out of here. If your country right or wrong. Or they're taught that about their church, that we're the right church and all the other churches are wrong. The teachings of the new church tell us that's so spiritually immature and prejudicial and carries a kind of privileged position with it that we need to lose. We need to learn how to lose looking at those people that way. So it's an important part of the rational development. The Ishmael doesn't want to stay with this movement out of us. The Ishmael wants to stay with, hey, my state's really the best state, and my arguments are the best arguments. And if I come up with an argument based on this literal sense of the word that says we're saved but other people aren't, wow, I'm pretty proud of myself for being in that group. And then those people, I can justify not loving them as much, or, they're important, but they're not that important because they're heathen. You going to ask a question? Yeah?
Me?
Ursa?
Yeah. And yet, the writings say that the new church is the crown of all churches.
Correct.
I always wince a little when I hear that in church, because I think, in a way, it sounds as if, we're the best.
We're not the
I
best.
understand it, but,
You probably heard when you were growing up also that the people that are in our church probably the worst because that's why they're into our church. They need it more than anybody else.
But what I wonder is why it says that.
Why we often say that it's the crown of all churches. Jesus Christ is the one God of heaven and earth. I take no credit for that, even though he's my God, or I believe in him to be my God. But it's not, it's no feather in my cap that I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. It's a gift. And this is my church, and it's the crown of all churches according to the teachings of the church. But how can I'm happy and I feel blessed, but it's not a matter of pride. It's a matter of humility. I mean, it ought to be, to me and to all of us, that we not stumbled upon this, but perhaps we're born into it, or our ancestors found it, or we ourselves came into it. But if we think, oh, aren't we great because we became new church, we got some work to do. And, yes, Gwenda?
I always look at it kind of like it's responsibility.
Yes.
The teachings are the crown, but it's because we know about them, we have to learn about them. It carries some responsibility with it. I don't know if that's true, that's just how I look at it.
Jerry?
Related to that, I think thinking of being wealthy is actually a really helpful frame of reference, because truths are spiritual riches. So to know a lot of truth is very much the equivalent of being wealthy, sort of through no great effort of your own. We're lucky enough to be spiritually wealthy, and like Glenda said, that carries a certain responsibility as well as a certain blessing. And certainly it's no great credit to us.
Yeah, you didn't choose your parents. Yeah. The Lord's desiring to adopt everyone into his family, the church. And another way that's put is grafted. The Lord takes all us rotten little shoots of feral beings and wants to graft us onto the tree of life. And grafting is talked about in several places in the Word, in the writings, that analogous to we being the vine, he being the vine, we being the branches. So I want to read a section. There's a subtle distinction made here, and I want to get into it. Maybe it's not that subtle. Maybe as I just was reading it several times, I go, ooh, is this splitting hairs? How do you understand this? So you tell me what this means here. The heathen equally with Christians are saved. Anyone can see who knows what it is that makes heaven in a person. For heaven is within a person, and those who have heaven within them come into heaven. So, heaven with a person is acknowledging the divine and being led by the divine. The first and chief thing of every religion is to acknowledge the divine. It's all making pretty good sense. A religion that does not acknowledge the divine is no religion. Okay? The precepts of every religion look to worship, thus to the way in which the divine is to be worshipped, and that the worship may be acceptable to him. And when this has been settled in one's mind, that is, so far as one wills this and so far as he loves it, he is led by the Lord. So the heathen are led by the Lord, even though they don't know the Lord, because the Lord works through what is divine good, whether or not he's acknowledged or known, right? So you don't need to know Jesus Christ, the Lord, Jehovah, anything of any of the testaments to be saved, right? You're all acknowledging that, right? So it's okay. That's good. So the Lord saves people outside the church as well as inside the church. I've just established that. It's pretty clear here.
There are other sheep who are not of this flock.
You know, that's actually quoted in this section in Heaven and Hell.
Okay.
So, and I said there's something subtle in here. So what do we have to do as a church to evangelize others? Is there any point in it? Why are we spreading this new church, the crown of all churches? But as long as people have good and want to do something better and acknowledge some universal love or goodness or some force in nature, a higher power, why not leave it at that and say it's good enough? Because everybody has religion, and if they just want to acknowledge what it is to do what's good and worship by following and doing what's right, isn't that good enough? You guys are saying, I don't know what to say now. What's he asking? Moral life may be lived either out of regard to the divine or out of regard to self and the world. Moral life. Everybody can be moral. There's a whole other section in Heaven and Hell about to lead the moral life, the life that leads to heaven. Everybody can lead the moral life, and if they do it out of regard for the divine, then their moral life, it says right here, becomes a spiritual life. If they do it out of regard for men in the world, this moral life is natural, but if they do it out of regard for the divine, it becomes spiritual life. In outward appearance, the two look alike, but inwardly they form completely different things. One saves and the other does not. So the person that refrains from doing evil to his neighbor because it is antagonistic to his religion, that is antagonistic to his concept of the divine, he refrains from doing evil for a spiritual motive, and this saves them. So, do we really need to evangelize or try to get the teachings of the new church out there if people are going to heaven anyway? Yes?
I think that the forces going the other way are so strong that if religious people, us included, didn't do something, we would be swept away.
So it's to protect, because we have more teachings that are protecting us in other ways?
Secularism and anti-religious thought is really strong, and it's really out there and very powerful. And it's, it's practically the law. So I think we better do something, and churches better at least stand strong, rather than
Okay.
be knocked over.
Mark?
Well, I concluded that it was about the development of the idea of God being human, that we need to keep educating or getting out there because of the human nature of God. And so the more complete an idea of God people have, the better they can fight evil.
Everybody's place in heaven depends upon their idea of the Lord or God. And if it's based on the teachings of the Lord God Jesus Christ, it's a much better image of the Lord. And the teachings that are available to those who know about the Lord are much more fully rich Christian lives than those without. And the teachings of the new church are even more fully, richly spiritual lives because of all the knowledge and truth we have from the Word. Jared's ahead of Karen.
To Naomi's point, it's Michael who fights the dragon. And Michael is the core truths of the new church, the returning to basics. God is one. Live the Ten Commandments. And other, that is necessary for opposing the dragon, like Naomi was saying.
Thank you. Karen?
I was going to say, and I think you said this in the sermon on Sunday, but the more we have of the Lord in us, the more of the Lord's divine truth we have in us, that's where his divine good can flow into. He can't flow into empty pots.
Right.
So we have to learn stuff so that his divine good, so the more that we know of his divine truth, the more of his love can flow in. So lots of people may know that they should love the Lord and da-da-da, but the more truth that they can know, like what Barb said about the Lord being human and those really important truths, the more of the Lord's love can flow in.
Right.
And the better their lives will be, and
Yeah.
it's just better.
It's much richer. You want to share the riches with people. People can go to heaven from outside of the new church, outside of the Christian church, outside of any church. The heathen who are idolaters and believe that God is in images and statues, which is a lot of where the heathen are being spoken of here. African nations, the never been touched by quote-unquote civilization. Those people, they go to heaven. And oftentimes it says faster than the Christians. And I'm going to get into that a little bit in the next couple numbers. Did you have your hand up, Barb? Or
I was just going to say, it goes back to the crown idea of helping that, wanting to share that too, so that there's more place for the Lord to fully reside.
Right. Yeah. The Lord wants us to have as much of him so that we're more fully conjoined with him. And you get to know somebody by reading their letters to you, which is the Word. You get to know them by the way they communicate, which is the Word. So study up on what the Lord said to you. Yes?
I was thinking the other thing is that evil spirits don't ever stop.
Right. Yeah.
So and they work through people who are open to them, and so if there isn't some people trying to connect with the Lord, really the evil spirits would just take over, yeah, if they could possibly do that. Yeah. I think.
Jerry.
Yeah, and that's where the urgency of evangelization comes in. It's not just a luxury to share with people, but there are people who are opposing hell with inadequate weapons.
Right.
And they, that they need the weapons that Michael fights the dragon with, the simple truths of the new church.
Well, the fact that there is one out of, did I say 64 chapters, 63 chapters? One is on the heathen. And a lot of other ones are on a lot of other ideas. We need a lot more variety of truths that the new church does offer than just ignorance, which many of the heathen nations are in ignorance. The idea that there's no salvation apart from the Lord should be understood that there's no salvation apart from what the Lord does with everyone. And let's put it this way. It is a divine truth that apart from the Lord, there is no salvation. Apart from the Lord, there is no salvation. But this is to be understood to mean that there is no salvation except from the Lord. And the Lord's not going to stop you from receiving him because you don't know his name. So the chapter goes on to talk about the ancient heathen and the wisdom of the ancient church, and how the ancient church left its origins, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and developed into the idolatrous nations that followed. But there was a lot of wisdom then that doesn't exist now. Interesting. But they understood that genuine wisdom, so the ancient people like the Greeks the classic Greeks that Christianity came to, and the Romans that Christianity came to, and all of what is now Europe, and the rest of the nations in Asia, the rest of the nations in Africa, they got Christianity more or less, and pretty much perverted everything they knew of Christianity. That's why the new church had to come. The Lord had to make a second coming. But those ancient heathens, and Cicero is mentioned as one, had a type of wisdom, and they always, it says, referred back to the wisdom of life being leading a good life. So heathen good is being spoken of a lot, and what that is, an eagerness to obey the Lord and follow and be obedient. One section that talks about Christians coming to heathen in the other world, and that one heathen nation wasn't willing to be called faithful. We'll leave that to Christians, it more or less says. They have the truth, so they can be faithful. We are simply obedient. And there are billions of those obedient people that inhabit the heavens.
I think that's one of the beauties of the writings, is that it does say that anybody who lives according to what they believe is right is going to go to heaven.
Right.
Which is a beautiful teaching.
One of the lovely, I think, passages that comes up here that is quite moving is the one that has to do with a heathen person who had images and idols. Swedenborg says, I read him the 17th and 18th chapter of Judges about Micah and how the sons of Dan carried away his graven images and teraphim and a Levite. I don't know if you remember that story, but they captured the images. They took the Levite who was serving this family and the teraphim. And I'm not exactly sure what the difference between teraphim is and graven images. I didn't look that up again. Does anybody know off the top of their head what a teraphim is? It's mentioned, and a graven image. So the heathen spirit who was present while that was being read, who in the life of the body had worshipped a graven image, he listened attentively to the account of what was done to Micah, and his grief on account of his graven image, which the Danites took away. Such grief came upon him and moved him that he scarcely knew by reason of inward distress what to think. So he was a worshiper of a graven image, and this story is about stealing the graven image of this family. Not only was his grief perceived, but also the innocence that was in all of his affections. There's another story that also talks about another spirit who was a worshiper of graven images, an idolater, having the same or similar experience, and that the innocence with which they love those things that represent, or even if they think they are divine, but they're not creating sacrifices of human beings to these images. That's a different thing. That's a fallen state of the ancient church and the desire to see the Lord represented in images that then changed into the worship of those images. But even those thousands or millions of people that followed those religions where they worshiped the images had a lot of good in their innocence towards the idea that this is the divine. And of course, in establishing the Jewish church to be a representative of a church in the Holy Land, that all had to be removed because the Jews themselves would have gone into the worst kinds of evils with those images compared to the person being spoken out about here. That kind of innocence and that kind of delight to follow the divine was missing among the Jews, and that's why they were chosen to just worship the very rituals, the things that Jehovah gave them. They were going to stick with that, with a kind of heathen or obsessive, this is how you get saved, is by doing this. And they fought tooth and nail to try to stay clean with that and went off and worshiped the gods of the other nations because it's so attractive. So you have a spectrum here of people who, in fact, are in the wisdom of life and in an innocence to love the Lord without the knowledges of the Word, and they don't pervert the knowledges that they don't have, and they innocently follow the Lord, and thousands or millions of them enter into heaven. In contrast, the reason why the Lord didn't just say, well, that's good enough, is that there was no real, genuine truths being given about the divine human of the Lord, and therefore the Lord had to be born on earth to save mankind, or that innocent idolatry of those good Gentiles would have eventually led them into the kind of idolatry that is not so innocent, the desire to use the correspondences that were known from the ancient church to turn them into magic, and what we hear about a lot when we do the stories from the Old Testament of those nations that needed to be cleaned out so that Israel could establish itself without that kind of idolatry. They were into basically another kind of idolatry, and that is they worshiped the gold and the Ten Commandments and the tabernacle and all those things. They invested that kind of affection in that and tried to keep it the way Jehovah told them they're supposed to keep it. And they didn't do a good job at that, but it at least held on until Jesus could be born. Yes?
The Israelites, they were supposed to wipe out all those peoples in the land of Canaan, and they didn't quite wipe them out.
Right.
Which meant that those people got stronger and they attacked.
Right.
But does that kind of represent the fact that we probably can't wipe out all of our peoples, and they can attack when we're not? Is there a connection?
I can't speak for you, but for myself, yeah. They keep attacking. Yeah, it does correspond to the fact that no one but the Lord was able at the end to completely eradicate all evils of his merry human, which he eradicated totally and replaced with the divine good and divine truth of his divine soul. That, therefore, we worship not a human being of human origin, but a divine being in the divine human. I don't know if that helps answer your question. The Jews, we get the picture that all that kind of idolatry is so wicked because they were told to wipe them out. Don't let anything stand. We're going to be doing the story of Gideon. He pulled down the altar of Baal, and he's going to go now and he's going to slaughter the Midianites with 300 men. That's the next story coming up in church on Sunday because we're doing the Gideon stories. Because these people that they hadn't gotten rid of earlier are coming back and pestering them over and over again. It's the whole cycle of the judges. There's always another enemy coming in because the children of Israel themselves aren't staying pure to their worship of Jehovah. They turn aside, they worship other gods. So there's that sense that, wait, the heathen, they're all evil. Look, the Lord had to wipe them out. But it's for the sake of what the Lord was doing in the Holy Land that they had to be wiped out. Not that in and of themselves, the worst thing you can possibly do is worship an idol. The Ten Commandments were given and said, don't worship any other gods but me. Those who don't have that, it's not their fault in worshiping other gods than Jehovah. If they're turning towards what is innocently good, they're not condemned. So I just want to bring up that point because it's brought up here that what we understand about the heathens that are so wicked and horrible had to be wiped out doesn't apply to everybody. It applies in the circumstances related to the children of Israel coming into Israel and removing all of that kind of perversion of what the heathens did with idolatry and magic. There's many, many people, as this story about the Micah and the Levite and the image. Swedenborg says, the holiness with which this person wept, he said, I never felt such a genuine sense of what is sacred. In a passage in the Arcana talking about another spirit that Swedenborg wrote about, this spirit was a Gentile, heard about the Christian teachings or the new church teachings that God had been born a man on earth. He said, boy, I wish I'd heard about that earlier. I would have left my religion and run to this place where we know the things that we have of the divine that you've told me. And why doesn't everybody love this? Why doesn't everybody get excited and study this? And it's talked about in the passage in Heaven and Hell too, that the ancients now, knowing what has been given to the new church especially, wonder why everybody isn't studying the wisdom of life presented in the new church, leaving their lands to come and gather. And of course, we all feel the same way, right? Why doesn't everybody see the value of this? 327. I've talked to some of the ancient church. It's called the ancient church, was established after the flood. And it is in these kingdoms, namely Assyria, Mesopotamia, Syria, Ethiopia, Arabia, Libya, Egypt, Philistia, as far as Tyre and Sidon, throughout the whole land of Canaan and on both sides of the Jordan. Now, that description of those peaceful places nowadays, right, that have a love for the Lord and peace among the people that are all in those, isn't that amazing? These are like the hot spot of fighting and wars and battles and skirmishes since forever. Gwenda, what was that thing you read to me about if you want to understand the stories going on in the Middle East? Here, read this little thing, and it's a quip about who's been helping who to become enemies of somebody else, to become enemies again of somebody else. Maybe you've seen this on Facebook. Yeah, it's like, and I'm listening to that, I'm going, yeah, right, yeah. And you wonder, what our part is as a from the ancient church group, and how it's so conflicted. These people the people of Abraham's Ishmael and Abraham's Isaac, descending into the Jews and the Arabs, or I should go this way, the Jews and the Arabs, they've been fighting since forever. But there was a time when the ancient church existed, and they were filled with wisdom, even in those places. The people of this church, mentioned in those nations, they knew about the Lord, that he was to come, and they were imbued with the goods of faith, and yet they fell away and became idolaters. These spirits were in front towards the left in a dark and miserable state. They're still in a dark and miserable state. Their speech was like the sound of a pipe of one tone, with almost no rational thought. They said that they had been this way for many centuries. So this is not new, that the people of that particular region, of those countries that have been mentioned, or regions that have been mentioned, have been in a fallen state based on negative things of idolatry. And they're all just sort of monotonously working on, killing the next enemy, or training their children to kill, or their grandchildren. Not that that's the only thing that is happening in those places, but the nature of that lack of Christian and new church teaching, when it falls, as you're pointing out, when it goes south, it goes really south. Almost without any rational. They were this way for centuries. They're sometimes taken out that they may serve others for some gross or natural low-order use. From this idea given to Swedenborg, he says, I was led to think about many Christians. Raise your hand if you consider yourself a Christian. That's us, many Christians, right? Many Christians. Are we among the many Christians that Swedenborg might have had in mind? Who are inwardly, though not outwardly, idolaters. So are you an inward idolater? Of course you are. You're fighting evils of every kind. The first commandment says don't be an idolater, worship the one only God. Are you perfect? No, I'm not perfect. No, we're inward idolaters as well as adulterers. Since they are worshipers of self and the world, and in heart we can deny God. A lot awaits us similar. So, the Lord's trying to balance out this idea. Not all heathen are condemned and going to hell. As a matter of fact, so many are going to heaven. And not all Christians have it really great and cozy. A lot of them are of the worst nature of the heathen. They're worse than the heathen. As a matter of fact, many of the good heathen can't stand Christians. Here we go. Pardon?
Did you say that, or is that in there?
Well, you tell me if I'm repeating what's in here. Okay. I spoke with them about the Lord. These are a bunch of Chinese heathen that he knows they're Chinese from these 4 things he saw. A woolly goat, a cake of millet, an ebony spoon, and the idea of a floating city. Now, I didn't know those are the 4 big pieces to know in the spiritual world. When you see those things represented before you, you're about ready to visit with some Chinese. If you see a floating city, a cake of millet, a woolly goat, and an ebony spoon. But, I don't read correspondences like some of those people who know what they're doing. Anyway, so he's speaking with them. Soon I spoke with them and at last I spoke to them about the Lord. When I called him, quote unquote, Christ, I perceived a certain repugnance in them. Now, do you know any people that when you start talking to them about Christianity and say you're a Christian, they kind of go, they might be bracing themselves for what they've heard from other Christians who they didn't perhaps had a good experience with. Or perhaps you yourself have seen the people walking towards your door and you know what they're carrying and you wonder, embrace yourself because they're going to talk about Christianity and Christ. And so these Chinese people that Swedenborg saw, he said when he mentioned Christ, he perceived a certain repugnance in them. But the reason was disclosed, namely that they had brought from the natural world, and in the natural world they had learned that Christians lived the worst life, a much worse life than they lived, and they were destitute of charity. So, what you learn on earth, you do take with you in heaven. And when you hear about Christians and Christ, it's like, ugh. Among these Chinese and the people that had come to them who were professing Christianity, what they learned about these Christians is that you don't want to be one of them kids. When you grow up, don't want to become a Christian. When I simply called him Lord instead of Jesus Christ, when I called him Lord, they were interiorly moved. Afterwards, they were taught by the angels that the Christian doctrine, beyond every doctrine in the world, prescribes love and charity, but that there are a few who live according with it. There are heathen who have come to know, while they lived in the world, both from interaction and also report, that the Christians lead bad lives, are addicted to adultery, hatred, quarreling, drunkenness, and the like, which they themselves, that is, the heathen, abhor. And they know that such things are contrary to religion. So I know I'm not telling you anything new. There are people in the other world that think that if you're a Christian, you probably need to be careful around you, because you might be, as a Christian, trying to get them to believe things that are abhorrent. And from their interaction with them and the report about Christians, these Chinese people and others, even now, today in the world, would go, I'd rather die than have to convert to your religion. Isn't that what the Crusades was about? To some extent. So it continues to talk about them, but that somebody said something about arguing tonight at the table. I thought I'm going to talk a little bit about arguing. Christians are very prone to arguing. Not that other people aren't, but the ones that really turn off other people are the ones that are arguers. And they're prone to quarreling, drunkenness, hatred, addicted, it says, to adultery and hatred, quarreling. Drunkenness is in there too, so when you think about addiction to substance, yeah. And Christians, among all peoples, seem to be among the worst at these sort of things. And you can wonder, no wonder why people then aren't so enamored with you saying that you're a Christian.
I'm just wondering something.
Yes?
Is it because evil spirits will tempt them stronger? Because if you didn't care about the Lord, didn't know about the Lord, there's really maybe nothing to tempt. But if you are connected to the Lord, there's a big win if you get that person.
Yeah, there's more to pervert, and the perversions that we have, given the truths that we have, the perversions that can take place are more dire. It's not that the heathen can't also go to hell, but we really need to be careful, because the profanation of those who have the truth and who live according to the truth and then turn away from it is worse than those who don't have the truth and just go down a negative path without the truth. They just follow their instincts without knowing they're not supposed to commit adultery, be inclined towards hatred, live bad lives, etc. So yeah, and the second coming didn't take place until all the truths, in my opinion, if I understand things correctly, all the truths that had been given by the Lord to the nations, and the heathen nations have converted to Christianity in hordes, either at the end of the sword, but many times by the use of good people just sharing the Lord's gospel. But eventually, everything that they got, they perverted. So we have to be careful, because that individual state can happen with any of us, and it's not good. It's worse than a millstone being placed around our neck and being thrown into the sea. Are there any questions? More questions? Oh my goodness. Is that clock right?
Yeah.
Boy, do I go on.
No, we started late. But Michael, just one thing. There are other sheep who are not of this flock.
Right.
Now, the Lord himself said that.
Correct.
And so you think, well, what? That other sheep must cover in all kinds of good people.
Right.
Or people who intend good. In other words, by that I mean, by intending good, living a life of what they believe to be charity.
Sure.
Which is a real fundamental thing.
Right.
But that could embrace a wide group. It
Yeah.
has to.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, right, but I mean, it has to go, I have another thing in mind when I think of it. I think about the people that are, well, for lack of a better term, who are sexually different.
Okay.
And You know, that causes all kinds of concerns in the kind of world we live in.
Sure.
And it certainly causes some excitement in the church, and in that way. And laity in the church, of which I consider some sort, don't believe the church doesn't really quite know what to do with it.
Yeah, we don't want to be harsh and critical of things we don't understand. And also, there are certain behaviors and certain actions that we try to say, well, this is right and this is wrong. And so, somewhere between those two, and it's not just saying, well, I know eating too much sugar is not good for me and I have more sugar anyway. There are behaviors that you just shouldn't indulge in because they are much worse for you spiritually and naturally, but primarily spiritually, than other behaviors. So we can't condone a number of things, and people are inclined towards them. How do we deal with people with sexual inclinations that are outside the binary norm with mercy and love? How would the Lord do it? And yet how do we accept or celebrate and or support that? Very carefully, because you can't just say, well, everything's fine. We can do whatever we want no matter what you're feeling. So it's tough because, and I don't claim to understand it. I've studied it both theologically and in counseling for professional counseling. It's a tough situation. Yeah. Well, that I came to the end of the section. I didn't cover every passage in that section, but just want to share what the heaven and hell tells us about this, the state of the heathen in the other world. May you not be. Yes, Jim.
I'm just remembering in Washington we had this wonderful, kind, outreaching advertising program where we published all these things that said basically the passage that people. If you don't have to belong to a particular religion, if you're doing what you think is right, you're going to go to heaven. We published that on September 10th of 2001. And on September 12th,
Yes.
I get a phone call. Are you saying Osama bin Laden will go to heaven?
Not my call. Right. Yeah.
Did you say, I'm sorry, there's so much static on this?
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
the timing was just bad.
yeah. Yeah.
To
Well,
say the least.
the Lord, I know the Lord has people in heaven that I might have a problem with because I don't have divine love of such infinite nature that I could love everybody the way the Lord does. And I thank the Lord that He can love me, but I don't have that. I don't have that same. And the Lord knows that. We don't have the divine love the Lord has to love the way He does. We have the divine love the Lord gives us to let us love the way we can love. So,
I was just going to say, it's not just about love. People have to repent before they would go into heaven.
right.
Of whatever.
Right.
So it's not just a matter of, well, you're loved, so
Right.
therefore you're in.
Right.
You know.
But it's love that draws everyone into heaven, and it's grace that saves everyone and brings them into heaven. And the parameters by which they'll be happy to be in heaven and stay in heaven have to do with what they really do love and what they've repented of that is not harmonious with heaven, because the devils can be up in heaven, they just can't breathe, so they don't really like it. At the time when the Lord had to make His second coming, they were able to invade the heavens because they could put on a kind of false respirator ability to pretend and feign angelic life based upon their magic or manipulative ratiocinations, etc. Those have been removed with the light of the second coming. So it just, people do get stripped and of their garments, as it were, and thrown out of heaven, where there will be gnashing of teeth, it says in the literal sense. It's not that anybody wants anybody to be hurt or punished or sad, but Heaven is a place where people can live in peace without being hurt by people who want to hurt them. And hell is a place where people can be in peace as much as they can, because they're just not going to be happy in heaven.
And they know that they aren't gonna be happy in heaven,
Right.
even though they try to fake it on occasion.
Right.
And Swedenborg tells them about this and that, trying to get in, but the point is, they really don't want to be there, so they fall back and reject.
Yeah.
When you invade a natural country and take all of its resources, it's natural. There's not a one-on-one correlation between your spiritual nature and the nature of those riches. When you invade a spiritual country and you want to take away their riches, the riches don't exist when you hold them because they're correspondent with your own state. You don't get anything, you don't get any benefits. There's no booty in heaven for the devils. It looks empty and barren because they don't have the eyes to see or the heart to really love what the other people are doing there. So who would want that? I'll go back to hell and torture people the way I like to. Anyway, with that, I think I need to stop. Been going on a bit. Thank you for coming out. Round of applause to Amy, for cooking. That was last week or last time. So thank you, Amy. And good night to you.